So, you just finished the first draft of your book, or maybe you're beyond the first draft. You've done some self-edits, you sent the book to beta readers, alpha readers, and a couple people for feedback. You're wondering if the story is good enough now and that you can move on to the next step, which is copy or line edits. But how do you truly know that you are done with developmental editing? That is what we're going to be talking about today. Today, I'm going over a little bit of what I like to call the ultimate book editing checklist, specifically for developmental edits. These are questions you're going to be asking yourself as you go through your story to make sure that the story itself is ready. Hello everyone, my name is Mandi Lynn. I'm an author, the creator of the Book Launch Planner series, and I make courses on book formatting and how to design your book cover, and I make weekly videos on the business of being an author. If you also want additional behind the scenes content, you can also join as a YouTube member. So first things first, for those of you who don't know, let's discuss what is developmental edits. Developmental edits is the very broad term, and it can sometimes also be called structural edits, but it's any type of edits that you're doing to edit the plot of your book, editing the story itself, characters, the pacing, all those different aspects. It also includes world building. Basically, it's anything that's not grammar. That is what developmental edits are. This is also the type of editing that tends to take the longest. So while other stages of editing focus more on grammar and different aspects of grammar, this stage of editing is purely just about the overarching story. So I did create a list of questions that you can ask yourself when it comes to developmental edits, and I broke it down into 4 different categories. We have plot, characters, world building, and pacing. Please note, I tend to use the save the cat method when it comes to writing fiction, so I'll be referencing a lot of those phrases and that type of story structure here today. So if you aren't familiar with Save the Cat, I actually have a whole YouTube video on that book. I will leave it linked down below if you want to learn more. Otherwise, let's move on and discuss what questions we should be asking ourselves when we think our book might be ready to move out of the developmental edit stage. So first batch of questions is all about the plot of our book. Is the plot engaging? Is it engaging from start to finish? Are there any points in the story that drag? Does the subplot make sense? AKA, does the subplot intertwine properly with the main story in a way that makes sense? Or does it feel completely separate from the main story and then they operate as 2 separate things? Because we don't really want that. We want things to all make sense together. Are there any inconsistencies? And it's really hard to spot inconsistencies yourself. This is when it's very helpful to have things like beta readers or alpha readers or critique partners to help point out inconsistencies. And inconsistencies can be in the way you describe characters or the way you describe locations or inconsistencies in the timeline. Is there a clear 3-part arc? And when I'm talking about 3-part arc, I mean we have the original world of Act 1, and then we have the character resisting the new world of Act 2, and then we have the character embracing the new world in Act 3. That is a very basic plot structure, and it's a structure we see in the Save the Cat method, and it's a great way we can see the character go through change over time. And lastly, when it comes to plot, does the story have a satisfying climax and resolution? And I also want to make sure that our subplots have a satisfying climax and resolution, because there's nothing worse than when either a book or a book series finishes and you feel like one of the subplots was forgotten and never got to see things wrapped up. Now, if it is a series, you don't always have to have absolutely everything wrapped up in book 1, book 2, and so on. If there's going to be future books in the series that are going to give us a satisfying resolution, but we want a satisfying enough resolution that readers are happy, but not like give them everything so they don't feel like they need to move on to the next book in the series. Alright, so that was plot. Let's discuss characters now. Does the main character have a clear want versus a need? In the beginning of the story, the character should be working towards what they want, but as the story progresses, they realize what they want isn't necessarily what's best for them, and they start working instead towards what they need. Are the relationships between characters believable and complex? Or maybe does it feel forced? And also, I should say that complicated relationships are okay. In fact, complicated relationships are very, very interesting to read as readers. If you watch my video on how to write drama into your story, you'll know that creating character maps and a very complicated character map is one of the best ways to create drama in your story. If you haven't watched that video yet, I highly recommend you check it out. Are the characters imperfect? We don't want our characters, especially our main characters, to be perfect and be able to take on everything that comes at them. I'm also guilty of this. With one of my books, Meet Me at the Summit, I made the love interest too perfect. And I need to give him flaws because at the end of the day, that's what makes a character realistic and relatable. Do secondary characters have a purpose? If you're going to have secondary characters in your story, especially if they're in your story a lot, they should be there for a reason. And sometimes you do have some characters that fade into the background, but they're not our secondary characters. Our secondary characters help the plot move along. Does each character have a distinct voice? And this is specific to dialogue. We don't want all of our characters to have the same sort of talking cadence and style of the way they talk. We want everyone to have personality. And this is trickier. It's a skill that you develop more over time. At the end of the day, we just don't want all of our characters to fit the same sort of cookie cutter mold that we create for ourselves. Now, let's move on to talking about pacing. Are scene transitions smooth? AKA, are there large gaps of time missing? And if they are, do they make it feel like there's something missing? Like, I even remember I read a book once where we hopped from one scene to the next, and as a reader, it felt very jarring. That doesn't mean you can have huge time gaps in a story, because you can. But if you do, you have to make sure you do it properly so it doesn't feel super surprising to the reader and that they feel like they missed something. Are there scenes that feel too slow or too rushed? This is especially easy to spot if you work with beta readers, where you can literally ask them if any of the scenes felt slow or rushed, if there was a scene where they started to skim things because it got a little boring, or a scene that they had to read over a couple times because they felt like they had missed some action because maybe it happened too fast. Are there any scenes or chapters that could be removed from the story without any impact? If you have an entire scene or chapter that if you deleted it, the book would go on and it would be okay, then that's your sign to just go ahead and delete it. This is actually something I was guilty of when I was writing my debut novel, Essence. I remember there were a couple of chapters that I deleted from this book because they didn't add any substance to the story. But I was a new writer and I was just getting a feel for things, so it was helpful for me to write the chapters, but it's important that if the chapters don't add to the story, you hit that delete button. And if it makes you feel better, you can create a separate document to cut and paste these unnecessary chapters into. That way it's not quite as permanent as deleting, but you are removing it from the final manuscript. Last but not least, let's talk about world building. And if you aren't writing a fantasy novel, you may think that you don't need to work on world building, but world building is something that is universal for all stories. It's just not as complex for things like contemporary novels, whereas fantasy novels, there's a lot going on and really intense world building. In contemporary novels, there's still world building, it's just a world that we are already familiar with. So we still need to establish things like timeline and location, we just don't need to establish a magic system. So with that said, one of the first questions that you want to ask yourself is, does the world building feel consistent? So this one is probably a little more specific to fantasy novels or even sci-fi, but are the rules and limitations of the world clearly defined? You don't want your readers questioning and feeling like you're making things up as you're going. Does the setting enhance the mood and tone of the story? Will it leave readers wanting to dive into the world themselves? AKA, are readers so obsessed with it that they just want to live in the world that you've created inside your book? Is there a sense of place that helps ground the reader? Again, you don't want it to feel like you're making things up as you go. You want this to feel like a real place that has a real set of rules and restrictions. And you also want to be very vivid with your descriptions so they can properly imagine it. Now, again, a lot of the questions that I talked about today are specific to fantasy and sci-fi, but that doesn't mean we can't also apply these questions to our contemporary novels as well. So those are some of the questions I thought were the most important, but if you have additional questions you ask yourself, make sure to add them in the comments of this video. And if you want even more questions that you can ask yourself, there's actually a page in the Save the Cat Writes a Novel book. It is page 75, assuming we have the same edition of the book. And on page 75, you will see what is a transformation test, which is just, again, another huge list of questions to ask yourself. And these questions are extremely specific to the Save the Cat Writes a Novel method. So if you use that method to write your book, it will be very helpful to go over this page and ask yourself some additional questions. Otherwise, that is it for today's video. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to comment down below, give this video a thumbs up, and I'll see you all in the next video.